Welcome to this new book news reading, celebrating writers whose books were published during the pandemic lockdown. My name is Karen Schubert, and I'm the director of Lit Youngstown, a literary arts nonprofit in Northeast Ohio. We have programs for writers, readers, and storytellers, and I'd like to invite you to a first Wednesday series reading, an open mic, featuring poets Darlene Montanaro and David Swerdlow, Wednesday, February 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. More information at lityoungstown.org. Thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to feature these wildly accomplished and witty poets today and to congratulate them on their publications. We'll follow this evening's reading with a conversation about these new books. CavanKerry is coordinator of creative writing at Salem State University. He is the author of poetry books, The 115 to Penn Station, and Jesus Was a Homeboy, both from CavanKerry Press, and Murder in the Marsh, a crime novel from Darkstroke Books. His new book is Set in Stone, published by CavanKerry Press. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Karen. Hello, everybody. I'm going to read solely from the new book, Set in Stone. And the first poem I'm going to read is a poem I wrote after going to the Dodge Poetry Festival a few years ago and having a conversation with the young man that was driving the shuttle from the hotel to the convention center. His name was Bell. I'm not so sure he knows that he's in this poem, but he is. It's called The Dream in Newark. We have just stepped off an elevator. I know, always an elevator, right? And I'm standing frightened with my hands pressed against the stone wall of a towering cathedral. And I'm looking out at a quartered courtyard, lush and flowering. And I see to my left my infant son, diaper and all, moving along the ledge. I'm reaching for him as I struggle to hold on. And just when I feel like I can't balance anymore, we are riding the elevator down, him safely cooing in my arms. I have the dream so often I get comfortable with it, like knowing the end to a horror movie. Don't worry, he lives. But it's not this dream, or the one about my dead mother singing at the kitchen sink, that haunts me. It's the other recurring dream, the one my father had after World War II. A home, a job, a family. The one the shuttle driver in Newark at the Dodge Poetry Festival talks about. He tells me now that he's home from Iraq, he doesn't trust the military anymore. The road to the dream, I think. He agrees with me about the illusion of truth, no matter which party is handing it out. He's happy not to be carrying a rifle in the desert, happy to be home with his kid. But I can tell the dream that haunts him is the same one a lot of returning vets have, the one he can't grab, no matter how often he reaches for it. My father was lucky. He got his, bartended his way to owning a piece of a restaurant, had a state job, helped me get a piece of mind. I look out the shuttle window, police on every corner, beefed up patrols for the poetry festival. I know that Newark, once a center for tanning and dye work, has a hard luck reputation. I've heard that Down Neck on the bend of the Passaic River is a safe place for dreams, but maybe not Lower Roseville or South Broad Street after dark. I want to tell the driver to hang in there, no matter where he lives, that dreams come true in Newark too. But I don't. Dreaming is easy. It's waking up that's hard. The next poem I'm going to read unfortunately is about a friend of ours who committed suicide. And when that happens, or when it happened to us, the effects of that, I couldn't stop picturing the act of that, as well as the ripples that affect all the people around. So the poem is kind of about that. It's called The Tobin Bridge for Pam. I have friends who are afraid of crossing bridges. It panics them to drive with the world spreading out on either side of them. I know this fear. Like so many of my own, it is linked to the worst of our imagination. I have a recurring dream about driving on a suspended bridge arched with a deck over the ocean. The more I drive in the dream, the steeper it gets until my car is almost upside down, and always just before it flips, I wake. I'm reminded of that dream today, crossing the Sagamore to Cape Cod, still numb from the image back home, our friend Pam standing against the dock and stepping into nothingness. After we heard, we lay in bed remembering as if she'd been gone for years. The trip we took to Ireland, her loaded down with shopping bags and Glengarriff, the kind way she had with our kids, her love affair with the Red Sox. My wife helped us so often over the years, and I remember getting exasperated once when I was told of another episode. Not because I wasn't sympathetic, but because I was frightened. I remember thinking, that could be me. We're all so close to it, aren't we? Clinging to that tenuous support, that bridge to sanity that keeps us suspended over what could be. This is how I see it. She is flying, not falling. The lights of downtown Boston are reflecting in the soft snowfall. Her eyes are closed. The hum of the traffic has faded. Her arms, like wings, lift her over the harbor. And in that moment, she knows much more than we know. Excuse me. I grew up on Revere Beach, just 5 subway stops from downtown Boston. It's a 3-mile kind of urban beachfront. And I had many jobs on that beach as a younger person. This poem is about that. It's called The Long Line. I come from a long line of beachfront vendors, caramel popcorn hawkers, bartenders, fry cookers. A long line of coffee pushers, Cracker Jack stumpers, cheeseburger makers. A long line of sawdust-footed, hot dog dragging, cigarette smoking, liquor swabbing drink men. I come from a long line of weary waiters thumping home after 8 hours in the box, 3 a.m., tired-eyed, half in the wrapper, drink pourers. A long line of sidewalk sweepers, cash collectors, grill scrapers, counter wipers, ashtray emptying, straw box stuffing, roast beef slicing, French fry bag stacking, barroom bouncing beach bums. Another long day, another short buck, hawk it loud and proud friend, long days, long nights, a long line of late day sleepers. Among other things, I was a middle school basketball coach for 19 years, and I played a lot of basketball as a kid. And I found out in my older years that it's definitely a young man's game, so I don't play much basketball anymore. But I miss coaching. I only stepped down a few years ago because of conflicts with my job at the university. But growing up, I was a huge Celtics fan. And so I remember a lot of those games as a kid and as a young man. And one of them were the games the Celtics played against the Philadelphia 76ers. So this is a poem for Julius Irving called House Call. Smoother than an orange Julius flying over the rim, like a 747 over downtown Philly, like a crop duster, like a piper cub through the mountains. Was that the doctor? The ABA, the NBA, short shorts and long socks, an afro swaying in the altitude, maybe a finger roll to save you face before it was a thing, maybe not, maybe a big swooping dunk from the mean fast break machine. You trying to choke out a win against Bird, beating my Celtics with your up and unders, with your foul line Jays, with your smooth rising silk. And before that, a college kid at a basketball camp, standing flat-footed under the basket, rising and dunking 2 balls at once. I was sitting under that hoop, watching you, while you stayed in the air for a week before touching down, before answering your house call. On my bedside radio, Johnny Most called you Julius, but we all knew you were the doctor. A shimmy here, a shimmy there, lifting, soaring, extending, a solo flight in the empty sky. And I'm going to read one more. A few years ago, my son, post-college, packed up his car and headed from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that was a kind of big moment in both our lives when that happened. So this is the title poem of the book called Set in Stone. A rosary that was my mother's tucked in the glove compartment of his car, and a copy of Exile on Main Street with instructions to play track 6 when he hits some lonesome desert highway. I love him so much my chest hurts, thinking of him riding off into his own life, me, the weeping shadow left behind for now. I know I'll see him again, but it's ceremony we're talking about after all. One growing up and one growing older, both wild curses. A train blows its horn, the light rising beyond the harbor, a dog barks from a car window, and the nostalgia, always dangerous, hits me like a left hook. I'm trapped between the memory and the moment, the deal we make if we make it this long, the markers of a life, the small worthwhile pieces that rattle around in my pockets, waiting to be set somewhere in stone. Thank you. Oh, that way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Kim Roberts is author of A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C., and 5 books of poems, most recently, The Scientific Method. Her book is By Broad Potomac's Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital, a poetry anthology published by the University of Virginia Press. Welcome, Kim. Please unmute.
There we go. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for all you're doing to help promote books that have come out since the pandemic started. So unlike the 2 people who I'm reading with tonight who are reading their own poems, I'm going to be reading only poems by others from this new anthology. The book is a collection of poems written by authors who lived in Washington, D.C. between 1800, when the city was founded, to about 1930, when literature completely changed and we get into literary modernism. And I really liked focusing on those early stories, which are less well known. And of course, I include some well-known authors in the anthology, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass. But I really wanted to put the anthology together was to argue with the canon, to not just accept those poets who are already well known, and to really focus on rediscovery of women poets, working class poets, poets of color, LGBTQ poets. So my mission in this book was really to give space to authors whose work is just as deserving of being read and studied and remembered as the poets who are better known to us. So I thought I would read just a few representative poems from the book, because that time period that the book covers is such a sweep. I have poems that go from the Federalist period all the way up through the Jazz Age. So this is a poem that it was written by Sarah Clark Lippincott, who published more often under the name Grace Greenwood. And she was an ardent abolitionist. And the anthology includes a significant number of abolitionist poets because DC was really the center of the trade in human beings in those years leading up to the Civil War. And because it was the capital, there was this huge tension between lawmakers who came from all over the country, especially the tension between those northern ones and the Southerners who lived in the city. So this is called The Leap from the Long Bridge. For anyone who knows Washington, D.C., the Long Bridge, there's a different bridge there now, but standing in the same place, it's now the 14th Street Bridge. And it is a bridge that crossed the Potomac River between D.C. and the hills of what is now Northern Virginia. This is called An Incident at Washington, and it starts with a little explanation. A woman once made her escape from the slave prison, which stands midway between the Capitol and the President's house, and ran for the Long Bridge, crossing the Potomac to the extensive rounds and woodlands of Arlington Place. No rest for the long day is past, and night on yon prison descendeth at last. Now lock up and bolt. Ha, jailer, look here. Who flies like a wild bird, escaped from the snare? A woman, a slave, up, out in pursuit, while linger some gleams of the day. Ho, rally thy hunters with halloo and shout to chase down the game and away. A bold race for freedom, on, fugitive, on. Heaven help but the right, and thy freedom is won. How eager she drinks from the free air of the plains. Every limb, every nerve, every fiber she strains. From Columbia's glorious capital, Columbia's daughter flees to the sanctuary God hath given, the sheltering forest trees. Now she treads the long bridge, joy lighteth her eye. Beyond her the dense wood and darkening sky. Wild hopes thrill her breast as she neareth the shore. Oh, despair, there are men fast advancing before. Shame, shame on their manhood. They hear, they heed the cry, her flight to stay. And like demon forms with their outstretched arms, they wait to seize their prey. She pauses, she turns. Ah, will she flee back? Like wolves, her pursuers howl loud on her track. She lifteth to heaven one look of despair. Her anguish breaks forth in one hurried prayer. Hark, her jailers yell, like a bloodhound's bay, on the low night wind it sweeps. Now death or the chain, to the stream she turns and she leaps. Oh God, she leaps. The dark and the cold, yet merciful wave receives to its bosom the form of the slave. She raises earth's scenes on her dim vision gleam, but she struggleth not with the strong rushing stream. And low are the death cries her woman's heart gives as she floats adown the river. Faint and more faint grows her drowning voice, and her cries have ceased forever. Now back, jailer, back to thy dungeons again, to swing the red lash and rivet the chain. The form thou wouldst fetter, a valueless clod, the soul thou wouldst barter, returned to her God. She lifts in his light her unmanacled hands. She flees through the darkness no more. To freedom she leaped through drowning and death, and her sorrow and bondage are o'er. This next poem that I want to read is by Charlotte Fortin Grimke, who came from a very prominent African-American abolitionist family. And this is a poem that she wrote about the end of the Civil War, when the Union Army took 2 days to march the length of Pennsylvania Avenue to celebrate the end of the war. And you get some of the sense of what it must have been like to be there and see this gathering of soldiers. This is the gathering of the Grand Army. Through all the city streets there poured a flood of human souls, eager, intent. One thought, one purpose stirred the people's blood, and through their veins its quickening current sent. The flags waved gaily in the summer air, or patient watchers 'neath the clouded skies. Old age and youth and infancy were there, the glad light shining in expectant eyes. And when at last our country's saviors came, in proud procession down the crowded street, still brighter burned the patriotic flame, and loud acclaims leaped forth their steps to greet. And now the veterans scarred and maimed appear, and now the tattered battle flags uprise. A silence deep one moment fills the air, then shout on shout ascends unto the skies. O brothers, ye have borne the battle strain, and ye have felt it through the lingering years. For all your valiant deeds, your hours of pain, we can but give to you our grateful tears. And now, with heads bowed low and tear-filled eyes, we see a silent army passing slow. For it no music swells, no shouts arise, but silent blessings from our full hearts flow. The dead, the living, all a glorious host, a cloud of witnesses around us press. Shall we like them stand faithful at our post, or weakly yield, unequal to the stress? Shall it be said the land they fought to save, ungrateful now, proves faithless to her trust? Shall it be said the sons of sires so brave now trail her scarred banner in the dust? Ah, no, again shall rise the people's voice, as once it rose in accents clear and high. Oh, outraged brother, lift your head, rejoice. Justice shall reign, insult and wrong shall die. So shall this day the joyous promise be of golden days for our fair land in store, when freedom's flag shall float above the free, and love and peace prevail from shore to shore. The next poem that I wanted to read is about a different war. This is a poem about the experience of women on the home front during World War I. The poem is by Alice Moore Dunbar Nelson, and she was the wife of Paul Laurence Dunbar and was sort of overshadowed her whole life by his reputation. She actually married 2 more times after his death. This is her most famous poem. It's called I Sit and Sew. I sit and sew, a useless task it seems. My hands grown tired, my head weighed down with dreams. The panoply of war, the martial tread of men, grim-faced, stern-eyed, gazing beyond the ken of lesser souls, whose eyes have not seen death, nor learned to hold their lives but as a breath, but I must sit and sew. I sit and sew, my heart aches with desire, that pageant terrible, that fiercely pouring fire on wasted fields and writhing grotesque things once men. My soul in pity flings appealing cries, yearning only to go there in that holocaust of hell, those fields of woe, but I must sit and sew. The little useless seam, the idle patch, why dream I here beneath my homely thatch, when there they lie in sodden mud and rain, pitifully calling me, the quick ones and the slain. You need me, Christ. It is no roseate dream that beckons me, this pretty, futile scene. It stifles me. Must I sit and sew? And I think I've run out of time there. I had picked out a few more poems, but this gives you some idea of some of the range of poets that I've included in the anthology. And with each poet, I also include some biographical information and some information about the how their work fits into the setting of Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much, Kim. Phillip Metres has written numerous books, including Sand Opera and The Sound of Listening, awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim and Lannan Foundations, and 3 Arab American Book Awards. He is professor of English and director of Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program at John Carroll University. His new book is Shrapnel Maps, published by Copper Canyon Press. Welcome, Phillip.
Thanks so much for having me, Karen. It was great to hear from Kevin and Kim, and I'm just so grateful to spend some time with you all tonight. Today was a particularly gray and snowy and cold day in Cleveland, and I don't know wherever you're listening from, but this is a dark time, physically, seasonally, and of course politically still in the middle of this pandemic. So I hope that you're well and that you're taking care of yourself, getting outside as much as you can, and staying safe. It was great in particular to hear Kevin's accent. I went to Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so Kevin's voice carries with it so many people that I've met, and I'm just grateful to hear those wonderful poems and to hear the poems of the people of DC. Okay. I am going to read a prayer to start called Solstice Prayer. In the name of the darkness and of the light and of the harness of winter's ice, in the name of the other and of the one, in the name of the weather and of the bone, in the shame of the ache of what I can't tell, in the name of the break that will not heal, in the same of the other and of the one, in the name of the anterior and the darkness to come, in the name of the middle, in the snow of the gloom, in the name of the straddle between road and home, in the rain of the cold, in the name of the sorrow, in the flame of the harp beyond tomorrow's morrow, in the shame at the marrow, in the grain of the sin that breaks up the furrow that I fall in the name of my hands that touch the forehead that stays shut, that touch the sternum that stays shut, then touch the heart that stays shut, touch the lungs that free the air, what can't be said, O ghost, and then lay bare. So that's a new-ish poem, probably from the next book, but I'm gonna read from Shrapnel Maps now, which came out in April of the pandemic year and was drowned out with everything else, I suppose. This is a book that's really meditating on the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. And I have a lot of different reasons for my interest in it. Some of them are personal. My sister married a Palestinian man many years ago. I have many Palestinian friends, and I have many Jewish friends as well who have deep feelings and connections to that place that that so many people come to find God or a place to belong. I actually live in a Jewish Orthodox neighborhood. It's close to my campus, but I'm very much a minority here, I suppose. I find much to celebrate about the community that I live near, but I also am aware of the ways in which I'm, not in that community. And as much as I admire the sense of belonging that the community has, I also occasionally find myself getting into some trouble. And like everywhere, we have conflicts with our neighbors, and we need our neighbors more than ever now, of course, but this is part of our collective reality. As I'd like to read a poem sort of about neighborliness and how hard it is to be a neighbor. And it's both itself sort of about my specific, more or less personal experience, but I hope it speaks to the larger issues that this book is trying to address. One tree. They wanted to tear down the tulip tree, our neighbors, last year. It throws a shadow over their vegetable patch, the only tree in our backyard. We said no. Now they've hired someone to chainsaw and arm the crux on our side of the fence, and my wife in tousled hair and morning sweats marches to stop the carnage mid-limb. It reminds her of her childhood home, a shady place to hide. She recites her litany of no, returns. Minutes later, the neighbors emerge. The worker points to our unblinded window. I want to say, it's not me, slide out of view behind a wall of cupboards, ominous breakfast table, steam of tea, our two young daughters now alone. I want no trouble. Must I fight for my wife's desire for yellow blooms when my neighbor's tomatoes will stunt and blight in shade? Always the same story. Two people, one tree, not enough land or light or love. As with the baby brought to Solomon, someone must give. Dear neighbor, it's not me. Bloom shadowed, light deprived, they lower the chainsaw again. Two neighbors. In Cleveland, snow so thick, it looked as if it were not falling, but hovering. I shuffled along the snow-banked side of Washington Boulevard, halfway to campus, when a Suburban scrolled past, slowed. The driver's window lowered to a woman in a copper wig. In a Brooklyn accent, she asked if I needed a ride. I didn't know her from Eve. She was brave or kind or both. I'm almost there, I replied. She said, you'll probably get there before I do. We laughed together in the falling snow as she rolled up her window. Into the minibus near Jerusalem, the young Palestinian climbed. He wore a Penn in his Oxford, black hair parted clean. We got to talking where we were from. He hoped, he said, to study engineering in Cleveland. The minivan braked. We pulled out passports. A soldier barked something we couldn't follow. The young man said something we couldn't follow, his hands dancing empty in the air. The soldier grabbed his wrists. We pulled away. We couldn't follow, and he disappeared, surrounded by three soldiers as we drew near Jerusalem. I'm thinking a lot during this recent time about people who are extremely vulnerable and in precarious situations, having to deal on top of with their own precarity, their own lack of having a country. For example, Palestinians are people who are migrants or refugees trying to find their way through this landscape such as it is, and just thinking about the challenges that they face every day. I'd like to read a poem sort of about, I suppose, my own complex feelings about my own identity, and this is about another encounter in my neighborhood. My dog just came in, so I might have to close the door. He's insistent on participating in this reading, and he'll be mute otherwise, but I feel his presence behind me. He's such an adorable little dog. My neighbor's handshake is firm. His black kippa's clipped close to his scalp, hair ruffling in the wind. With plastic rake, I'm scaring the final evidence of fall from my drive. So why can't my daughter play at your house with your daughter, I say, trying to understand. His smile winces. My wife, he says, she grew up only around our kind. I look away, not wanting to salt his pain. I think we're generous to others, he says, trying to explain, not like the Arabs. Looking back up, I see the red-headed soldier at a West Bank checkpoint, my Arab father engaged in conversation. You're from Brooklyn, what are you doing here? Each of them could have asked the other. My checkered keffiyeh hangs in the closet, visible only to me. White flakes descend. He talks around the awkwardness. I scrape the last dead leaves. The Arab in me still wants to invite him in for tea. The American in me wants the Arab to turn and disappear in the falling snow. One of the things I heard recently is that Israel is doing very well with managing the pandemic and offering vaccines to its citizens at the same time that Palestinians essentially have no access to this vaccine regimen, even though under international law, people who are under military rule are obligated to be taken care of by those who are ruling them. That is not what's happening right now. Thinking also about the generations of Palestinians who fled, were pushed out, left their homeland from villages like this one called Izdud. This poem is for Fadi Judah, a wonderful Palestinian American poet who's both a wonderful poet in his own right and translator. And I'm very grateful for the times that I've been able to learn from him and to sort of walk with him in his journey. Izdud is where his people come from. Izdud. Dear descendant of the disappeared, you ascend the pillar of your own air, spin and span whole abysses with lines translating there to here and here, where wind winds in dry wadis, hoists sea in invisible handful after invisible handful. Izdud now your email address and digital image of branches through windows within school ruins. A refugee points with his cane to what he only can see. You argue against the argument against yourself. You yourself make and home in. Kiss my blind eyes clear. Close keyholes with opening. Homeland you cradle in vowels. What was not never yours. I'll hold it here till you return. And I suppose one last little poem. This is from another book called I Burned at the Feast. Selected poems of Arseny Tarkovsky, translated from the Russian. This is a translation I did with Dmitry Posurtsev. My sight, which was my power, now blurs, two invisible diamond spears. My hearing subsides, full of ancient thunder and the breathing of my father's house. These knots of thick muscles slacken like gray oxen lying upon the plowed field. The wings behind my shoulders yield no light when evening darkens. I am a candle. I burned at the feast. Gather my wax when morning arrives, so that this page will remind you how to be proud and how to weep, how to give away the last third of happiness, and how to die with ease, and beneath a temporary roof, to burn posthumously like a word. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thank you so much, Phil.
You wanted me to start with
Thank
a
you for that
question?
incredible. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry, skipped out there.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I have a question for Philip. First off, thank you for your collection. It was heartbreaking, and the plight of the Palestinian people. And I was stuck with so many lines. I was glad you read that tree poem, and I think of the line later on that the bulldozers will doze the roads so that every road ends in a wall. I mean, I kept going back to some of these lines. So thank you for that. But my question is a more technical one. And your book has ghazals. I always mispronounce that word. So sonnets and odes and prose poems and even erasure poems, right? So can you talk a little bit about choosing those forms for the type of book that you were writing, and how'd you go about that?
Thanks, Kevin. Wow. I don't really know exactly how to answer it, because the book, I'm sort of obsessed with form as a essential element to what poems are, and the idea of an architecture of language that poems offer us. And so I think that there's probably a lover's quarrel in my work between what we might call received form or traditional form, and sort of straining against them or breaking them, or finding maybe avenues inside them for other things. And I think that's actually what an erasure is, like it's a way of sort of talking back to some canonical or official or powerful text, performative text in some way. So, given the material, and given, I suppose, the legacy of British Empire, which sort of shadows over, Palestine and Israel, and our own political power, I wanted my relationship to form in the book to be vexed and to be troubled, and to kind of be honest about the fractures, the shrapnel, really, that as amazing as English literary culture is, that British power has actually also done such harm. And so I think just like one simple little thing is, I got interested in prose as a sort of vignette, which might be less, less overbearing, or less compressed and distilled as some of the lyrical elements of the book. So I wanted to kind of create different kinds of modes that you could sort of, here's a story, right, in prose, here's something more technical or something. So I don't know if that answers your question at all. Thanks.
That was a great answer. Thank you. Yeah.
So should we just freewheel this?
Freewheel it.
Freewheel it. Kevin, one of the things that I mentioned, your accent, and it's not even just an accent. It's like it's a world that you're sort of carrying in your work, and an example of this is you use the term Hamburg, which is very distinctively a sort of vocabulary that I had to learn when I arrived as an immigrant from the Midwest to Worcester. I'm curious, like I look at your work and with a sort of admiration for a sense of belonging that you have. Do you have do you have your own vexation about where you come from? And is that, I mean, I saw little elements of it in some of the poems, but that one poem where you say, I come from, these people, that poem is like a poem I don't feel like I could write. And so I'm sort of curious about that.
Yeah. First off, let me just full disclosure. I went to Assumption College down the road from Holy Cross, and my brother went to Holy Cross. So I lived all over Worcester for those years. It's funny, Revere, where a lot of these poems come from. My mom lived in Salem till she was 96 up until a few years ago. So I never was kind of out of touch with the place. I was always going back, even though I moved around and found other places to live. And I think when I started writing seriously, I guess when I started doing it more, I found myself going back there and really kind of revisiting a place that I might not have thought that much about for quite a few years. It was like I wanted to get out and leave and move on. And then I was in this place where now I wanted to go back and revisit it and think about the stories my father used to tell me, or the characters that I met that at one time I wouldn't want to be near, but now I want to write about. And, so there was a whole kind of resurgence of what this place meant to me, not only emotionally, but from a storytelling point of view. And as you know, my poems are pretty personal narrative poems, and they're about storytelling to me. And I found a lot of stories back in this place that I grew up in that I guess I never realized I had, until I started digging. And thank you for the question. I hope I answered it.
Yeah, well, maybe I could ask the same question of Kim. You put together this anthology of DC sort of related poems, and you actually talked about how there was a tension at various points between, probably always a tension in DC between those who come, as parts of administrations or those part of the political structures, and those who are from there. And I'd be curious to know what your relationship is to DC, and just in terms of that stew of constant, change, and being at the center of empire, the whole thing. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting. The three books that we're looking at this evening are so different, and yet what they share is a sense that a specific place, a specific geography can take on a character of its own. So I was thrilled that I got paired with the two of you and these specific books. And as for DC, I mean, you're absolutely right. I was trying to tell the story of one specific city, but I was really struck the more that I put these poems together of how DC becomes sort of representative of the country as a whole. The issues that are specific to the city, it seems to be, those are the larger issues of the country. But of course, what makes DC unique is that it's sort of like a company town. There's really only one industry, and that's the federal government. And so there is always there's always been this tension between I guess what you'd call sort of the city of neighborhoods, the local city, and that federal presence. And that was especially true during the Trump era, when the city, which is very liberal, overwhelmingly Democratic, was out of sync with the power structures. And of course, that has happened many times during the city's history. But during those periods leading up to the Civil War and through the Civil War, the balance was actually shifted, and the city was quite conservative and very much connecting with more of a Southern sensibility, and certainly a Southern economy built on the labor of enslaved people. So, looking at that history of the city and how it's changed was really instructive for me. But I guess I would sort of throw that same question back at you and say, I think that Kevin's book, certainly Revere becomes like a character in the book itself. And Kevin, thank you so much for reading the Tobin Bridge poem, which I think is just, it's an amazing tour de force in that book. My book, of course, is, all about DC, history of DC. But Phil, your book is really about a place, a loss, a lost place. The place is still very much there, but it's sort of described by its absence, I would guess. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
There's a wonderful quotation that I used in the afterword by a Palestinian poet named Ghassan Zaktan, in which, his background is obviously Palestinian and probably Muslim, although of course there are many Palestinians who are Christian. And he said, Muslims like to begin the history at this, battle of Ajnadain, and Jews like to begin the history with biblical references, but he says we should belong to all 10,000 years of history here. And I hope that the book represents the kinds of palimpsests that are, that is every place, actually. Those layers of history, those layers of belonging and narrative, and both living and past. And I hope that the book does some job at revealing some of the invisible layers, or the layers that are kind of kept out of sight. Of course, there is the deep sadness of the dispossession of Palestinians, and a sense that they've never been recognized and acknowledged as a people. So that's part of the tone of the book that you're responding to, this kind of tragic element. But I did want to write a book that, although articulates a solidarity with that loss, that to acknowledge the ways in which belonging is multivalent there. And that was why it was really important for me to include some poems from folks around here that I know, and also poems that represent points of view that articulate the Jewish connection and attachment to that place, and the desire to be in a majority situation. So yeah, again, I'm talking too long. I could talk forever about this book, but I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's funny, I feel a little disheartened because I think, one always hopes, like, whatever we're working on, that somehow it will make some kind of ripple in a larger conversation. And, the larger conversation for the last year has been, the former president of the United States, who shall remain nameless, and COVID. And so it's very hard to have other kinds of conversations. And but I hope that at least the book models a sense of listening through what is a deeply painful reality for a lot of different people. I was struck by the leap from Long Bridge. Like I was thinking about all of the stories that end with people jumping off bridges or jumping into space. I was thinking of Thelma and Louise, which was this act of freedom, which was also an act of, death, choosing death over being trapped by patriarchy. And thinking of that Toni Morrison novel, Song of Solomon, that ends with a man leaping into the abyss. We don't know if he's going to fly or, just like it's the leap itself. And what an interesting thing. I'd never read that poem. Were there any poems that kind of like just shocked you and because as you said, part of what you were doing was a recovery project, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I was able to find several really amazing poets who were born enslaved. And one in particular, I found a poem by a young man, Arthur Bowen, who was at the center of DC's first race riot, which is referred to usually as the snowstorm. And I had known all about the particulars of this early race riot for a long time, but everything I knew about Arthur Bowen was from white witnesses, court documents, the letter, these pleading letters that the woman who was his slave mistress wrote, diary entries about the incident. So I was totally shocked when I found in an early newspaper a poem written in his hand. It's the only thing that I know of that he wrote himself. And I think it's really, it speaks volumes that he wanted to defend himself in a sort of a form in poetry that would try and speak directly to the emotional connection, the emotional life of white readers of that newspaper. So yeah, no, there were lots of times when I uncovered poems that I was amazed at how the history of these earlier eras just came alive through the poems. And I was also continually surprised at how these early poems brought to mind current issues, that they weren't this dusty old history, that they were poems that really resounded with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of these current issues that are so much in our minds. They're there. The seeds of them are there in these poems.
Kevin, can I ask you more about Dr. J? Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, sure.
So you were at the game, the All-Star game where he did the dunk contest, or was that?
No, no, he was older than me. I was at a basketball camp in the summer, and he was a camp counselor. He was at UMass at the time.
Oh my God.
And there was a lecture on improving your jumping ability or something. And he stood under the basket with two balls, flat-footed, jumped up and dunked them both at once. And we all stood there and sat there agape, just kind of like, what just happened? And that was my introduction to Julius Erving. And then I just, I watch him now as a basketball fan, and he did the stuff that a lot of people are doing now a long time before they did it. You know, those breakaway layups and those fantastic dunks and hanging in the air and just acrobatic finishes. And he was kind of the only one doing it when he was doing it, you know, one of the few doing it at the time, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic story just to him. I actually tried to find it. I was keep trying to find ways to send him the poem, because I wrote a poem about Bill Russell, and I did get that in someone's hands. I don't know if Russell ever got it. And recently I wrote a poem about Maceo Parker, and trying to get it to him too. I always think it'd be such a kick that some of these guys that I grew up admiring would end up with a poem of mine in their hands. But you know, one of these days, maybe.
That's a wonderful idea. I wish I had a hookup for you, but I don't.
It is a wonderful idea, and let's hope that this can happen. And this is a good place to end, although I wish we could continue the conversation. But I just want to thank you all so very much for this incredibly moving reading and conversation. And I wish you well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Philip.
Great to talk with you, Kevin.
Thank you,
Great to
Kim.
talk with you, Kim.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And
Yeah.
Karen,